Aloha everyone, what's going on my dudes? Welcome to another RuneScape news coverage video. For this video we're going to talk about the player avatar and what Jagex plans on doing to improve it and the path it took on the way to do so. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the video. Let's go.
Cats is the illest. What you talking about, Willis?
Alright guys, this is all information coming from the latest live stream and there's a lot to cover, so I'm gonna pretty much just jump right into it. So the whole aim of this player avatar change is to continue the evolution of the player avatar into the new era. You're seeing on screen the various different iterations that your player character has gone through throughout the years, with classic being sprite based, the old school RuneScape look going on to full HD, and RS3 with significantly more polygons than the previous old school RuneScape version, and this new iteration is going to be no different with even more polygons and more polish. Now with this update there's a lot they want to do and accomplish, and they're planning the steps right now as we speak to make that possible. There has been lots of challenges with this already, but the team is very motivated to get it done. So this update as a whole they're referring to as the player avatar refresh, as opposed to a rework, which we will discuss as to why that distinction is important, but for now just know that it's a little different. One of the biggest reasons is they cannot make a huge tech change all in one go. It would take an extremely long time and we'd never see the avatars be brought up to date. So it has to be iterative. So the team had to decide on an entry point on where they can deliver the most value, making it as meaningful as possible and refreshing. That is where they settled on the initial character creation screen, and this is going to be the start of this entire project. It's where most players will first ever interact with the game, so it felt like one of the most fitting places. Here they're aiming to tackle 16 different outfits for each gender, so 32 in total, and over 60 hairstyles among the two. So with that said, that is the scope of this update, the player avatar refresh. They are only focusing on the player customization that could be found on the initial character creation screen. So that does not include things like any of the cosmetics or overrides or anything like that. However, doing this will open the door for all of those other types of outfits, etc. going forward to be implemented at a much quicker fashion than this initial project. So as I was trying to get at, they're taking the mesh and the texture assets from the character creation screen and do a visual refresh on them, so that they remain the same content at its core, but they have evolved with a fresh look and higher graphical fidelity. And this will become the building block that they can expand on, as I said, and go on to other outfits and cosmetic overrides. Next up, I just want to do a quick fire session to go over some of the things from the current player model and some of the challenges that posed with this project. So starting off, we have just a bit of information, the kit parts. The avatar is modular, so the player character comes in pieces. That's not going to change with this update, but just so background information. And one interesting tidbit is that males don't actually have a lower jaw because the beard is actually a separate piece in the kit. If your character doesn't have a beard, it still counts as one of the beard pieces, just minus the hair, which is pretty funny. Next up, we have geometry. As you can see here, there is a decent amount of complexity with the current mesh that we already have in game. They say it's a reasonable amount, but not as much as they'd like. And with this current mesh, they are forced to distribute it in a way that's not ideal for animation. Next up, we got UVWs. This is just quickly to show how textures wrap around a character. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, nothing particularly interesting. Next up, we have vertex colors. This is a very cheap and quick way of adding shading into the player model, and so we have right now. But as you're going to see later on in this video, they have new methods of achieving shading, and it's way more immersive and way more real. So I'm sure you're going to be excited to see that. Next up, we have labels. This is particularly interesting as it pertains to RuneScape. So in most animation, your character, your model, your rig, whatever, has a skeleton. And to animate it, you basically tell the skeleton what to do and the rest of the model will follow. However, in RS, they mark points on the surface of the model as opposed to the interior. Then the engine tries to imagine bones underneath, and then you animate that imaginary bone. It's a very weird process, not standard at all, and definitely has posed challenges with this project. Next up, we have the chat head. If you did not know, the chat head for when you talk to NPCs, do quests, etc., that's an entirely separate model marked up in a very different way than the standard character model, and has completely different content that sits on it. So that's another challenge. And with all these challenges, you're probably asking, why don't they just completely rework it as opposed to doing this refresh and building upon the already existing system that isn't necessarily standard or modern practice? And the reason being, or the reason they give, is that if they can prove that they can do it this way without breaking the game, it'll give them more confidence to remove and shift away from that old animation system. NPCs in the game already use a more standard system, which is why some of the bosses or any monsters or characters you see in-game can do things that the player characters simply can't. But they have to lay the groundwork first by providing a much more visually improved character model. Then they can work on the animation system. Having said that, we're going to take a look at the models themselves and see how they actually look. Keep in mind that the model you're seeing is a much higher poly count than the one you're going to see later towards the end of the video. However, they're going to look very similar. So the new models are actually bound to the exact same proportions as the old model. This process took them a long time with many iterations trying to nail down the look that they wanted for the player character, and as I said, they had to do it over and over and over again. Now, taking a look at the male and the female bodies here, the right ones you're seeing here are the current mesh that we already have in game. The left are the new models. As I said earlier, the proportions are going to remain the same, but you can clearly see that the detail is much more fleshed out, and it will make it more elegant and balanced. Now, if we take a look at the shading that I talked about earlier, currently we use the vortex colors, which is a much cheaper way to apply shading, but you can see here the newer models are much more subtle when they interact with the light. Light sources can bounce off the model, and we're going to see that actually in game at the end of the video. There is a smooth rolling of light over the musculature of the character, as opposed to the more jarring and faceted look that you see on the old model as you see it panning around. The next thing I want to touch on is hair. If you're looking at the old models, or the ones we currently have, they're much more geometric with their shapes, whereas the new ones have a better sense of flow and look much more like realistic hair. Now with this, they're not going to completely redesign any of the hairstyles in the game. You could look at it more as a reimagining with higher detail. They're also experimenting with the idea of transferable hair, which won't be part of this project, but is something that they can do in the future, and ultimately could do things like have females with full beards if you're so inclined, which would be pretty funny. But again, that's not something that's going to be part of this release. It's just something they can branch out once the core system is in place. Moving on, I want to briefly touch on costumes. You can see it here and you'll see it in game later, but one thing worth noting is the layers that they have with the new models. A lot of armors and costumes, etc., that were coming out, especially a couple of years ago, had this Christmas present wrap effect where they tried to mimic the look of layers on a flat 2D texture. And I don't think anybody ever thought that looked good. With this, they're certainly drifting away from that and actually giving the sense of layers, as you can see here on this new model. It's very evident. And the last thing I want to show you before we actually see it in game is looking at the old mesh versus the new mesh. You can see the wireframe, the red lines, etc. The new one is much more evened out and looks much more like a grid, as opposed to the old one that has a lot of odd shapes, triangles that don't really make much sense. Reason why this new grid mesh is important is because, as I said earlier in the beginning of the video, the models you were seeing earlier had a much more high poly count. These ones that are actually in game have a much smaller one, but they generally have the same shape in their mesh. So when you add textures to it, you can just downscale it and it will still look extremely well. Having said that, we're going to finally jump into the game and have a look at what it looks looks like so far. So what you're seeing here is a very hilarious animation to say the least, but it displays both the old mesh and the new mesh showing a wide range of motion. The reason why this is important is to show that the new mesh, as different as it was than the old one that we showed you before, still is working or keeping up with all the range of motions from the old mesh, which is very good news. And next up here, you can see a side-by-side comparison of what looks like with the old character model and the new character model with the exact same outfit graphically modeled with the new design as opposed to the old design. So here you have a clear understanding to exactly how much we're getting an improvement with this change. The final thing I want to touch on is showing off the light. I showed you the lighting earlier in the video in their 3D modeling program, but here's what it looks like actually in game. You can see the warm light bouncing off of the player character, and as you turn around and look at the darker areas, you can see the shadows are much cooler and more bluish. Even when you stand near a candle light and walk away from it and approach other light sources, you can see the light interacting with the player character, which is certainly a subtle thing, but really helps with the immersion and making the player character feel like they are actually a part of the world that they're interacting with, as opposed to just being plopped down there and feeling out of place. And that pretty much sums up the gist of what was shown off with today's live stream. Once again, to reiterate, the scope of this update is aimed to look at only the things that you can find on the character selection screen, which does mean if you're a character that uses a whole bunch of cosmetic overrides, you might not even really notice much of a difference afterwards, but maybe this will convince you to change up your wardrobe slightly. And once again, doing this provides the stepping stone to improve all outfits and overrides available to the player character now. So it's just the very beginning stages as far as where we're at right now. Anyways, leave a comment, let me know what you think about everything we discussed in this video. I know it was a lot, but do give me your thoughts. I'm going to wrap up the video there. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button. If you're not subscribed yet, you want to stay up to date on all things RuneScape related, then hit that subscribe button. Anyways, I appreciate you watching. I am out. Aloha.